Record.
Okay. Oops. All right. Sorry, let me find that. Move that. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of something that Tammy, Marilee, and I have been working on for a couple months now, and we were really interested in trying to better understand, why people use health interventions or why they stop using it really. And so as we dug a little bit more into the literature, we found, people weren't really talking about sustained use that much. And so it kind of motivated us to try and better understand how sustained use was used in the literature. And then also, kind of what are the factors that enable sustained use and how do people measure it? And so this was the title that we came up with for the manuscript. Um, and yeah, so I'll launch in. So poor air quality and unsafe wash practices, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene, they rank among the top 10 risk factors for disease burden for children under 5 and the elderly. And poor air quality comes in at 4 and 8 for both age groups, while unsafe wash practices come in at 7, 9, and 10 for children under 5. And even though and so like these and so poor air quality and unsafe wash practices have other adverse health effects that also show up as some other risk factors. So, poor air quality has also been associated with cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, and poor mental health. And then unsafe wash practices, they're usually associated with measurements in incidences of diarrhea. And so that has implications for children's development, so like child's weight and their wasting and stunting. And so there's clearly a health inequity that exists. And so there's like a need to kind of address why this is and kind of interventions that are designed to address this problem. And so to that end, the UN developed the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, which I'm sure most, if not all of you, are very familiar with. And the aim of the SDGs is to achieve peace and prosperity for people and the planet. And so they came up with these 17 SDGs with the goal of achieving them by 2030. And so they range from no poverty to good health and well-being. There's clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, and then all the way to peace, justice, and strong institutions. And so kind of honing in a little bit more on SDG 6, which is the clean water and sanitation, and SDG 7, which is the clean and affordable energy. I know that these two infographics are a little bit busy, but the main takeaway from these is just how much more work there is that needs to be done, right? And so on the left-hand side for SDG 6, it says that in 2022, there were 2.2 billion people that lacked access to safely managed drinking water and basic hand washing facilities, with 3.5 billion people lacking access to safely managed sanitation. And then on the right over here, we see that in 2019, there was about 2.6 billion people without access to clean cooking. And so even though there have been some improvements, right, decreasing from 3 billion in 2010, there's still this huge demand and this gap that exists in kind of reducing these health disparities. And that's not for a lack of trying, right? There's wash and cook stoves are huge fields of research. And so with wash, like if we look at ceramic water filters, and then there's improved cook stoves over here, and the portable air cleaners or packs haven't really been associated with or discussed in the context of the SDGs, but we included them because they are, I think people are becoming more aware of the importance of clean air, especially indoors, post-pandemic, and then also with increasing wildfires. And then it also ties in a little nicely with the Sapphires project. And so what I want you to take away from this slide is the fact that there are a bunch of different interventions that have been designed. And so this photo on the right it's actually me in one of the cook stove closets at EPA in North Carolina. And I actually learned that they have two cook stove closets. So you really see that there's a whole bunch of different designs. So there's not a lack of research going into the design and the implementation of interventions that are producing either cleaner cooking or producing clean water. So why is it that there's still this huge gap between in health for some different populations? And so some of the challenges are the fact that these interventions are only really effective if people are using them correctly. And so this statement is kind of twofold in that, these interventions have to be used correctly, meaning that if you have a cook stove that's designed to burn pellets, but the user only has access to either wood or charcoal, it's not going to be as effective. The flip side of this is that these interventions have to be used. And so that means that they need to be used consistently over a long time. And many studies actually only focus on initial acceptance and early use, despite the fact that they acknowledge sustained use is a challenge. And so there's challenges in terms of study duration. The longer it is, the more time intensive it is, the more cost intensive it is. Also, with what kinds of measurements do you make to measure sustained use, right? Are you basing this off of surveys, or are you going to leave some kind of logger to see when people are using things? And then another challenge is, what exactly is sustained use and how is it defined? If it's based off of duration, like a time frame, this can vary by intervention. So not just within cook stoves or within water filters, but by each of these designs, because it might be that some of them are designed to last longer than others. So just the definition of sustained use is kind of unclear. And here's a photo on the bottom right of or a figure from a paper from 2009 that had done a follow-up study of water filter usage in Cambodia. And so on the y-axis, it's the percentage of water filters that were in use at the time of follow-up. And then on the x-axis is the time since implementation. So you can see that at about 6 months, it's around 90% of participants were still using the filter. And you see a steady decline over time. And then by the time they hit around 4 years, it's around 10% of people are still using it. So there's this decline of around 2% per month. So there's clearly an issue with getting people to consistently use these interventions that are being given to them or provided to them. And so these were some of the aims of the manuscript. So we summarized the theories of technology adoption, and then we defined some of the use phases as well as terminology. And then we conducted a scoping review to identify common cessation points and determinants of sustained use. And then we synthesized findings to identify barriers and enablers of sustained use, and then provided some recommendations for practitioners. So there are a lot of technology adoption and behavior change models and frameworks, and I'm not going to go into depth over them, but on the left-hand side, we kind of provided a brief description of each of these different models. And then kind of more broadly, some of these models look at technology adoption either for like a community or on an individual basis, and others are focused more on behavior change, how you get someone to adopt a new behavior. And of all of these models, it was really only the trans-theoretical model, which is also called the stages of change model, that explicitly considers long-term behavior change or adoption. So I have it down here where, there's these different stages that you enter, and then you can see on this top left quadrant, there's this relapse and maintenance phase. So it shows that, this is the person before they think about this behavior change, then they start thinking about it, then they decide to do it, they take action, and then they may relapse, but then they enter some maintenance. So this long-term behavior change or adoption of this behavior. So there's clearly a gap in knowledge of how we understand, of our understanding of how people kind of adapt to this long-term change of behavior or why they start using things over a long term. So for the scoping review, this was the question that kind of guided the research, and it was, sorry. What are the barriers and enablers to sustained use for household level environmental health interventions? And so on the left, I have some of the inclusion criteria, and the important parts are really, we looked at household interventions, so water filters, cook stoves, and portable air cleaners. And we specifically wanted to look at household interventions versus community interventions because the responsibility of maintaining or taking care of the intervention is different when it's communal versus when it's individual, right? And then papers that we also, the papers that we included also had to assess factors related to sustained use. And then they had to measure use at least 6 months after the distribution of the intervention. And so this was kind of arbitrary, but not really in the sense that, there's other WASH papers that had looked at sustained use also used this 6-month kind of delineation. So even though it's kind of maybe not 6 months might not be the most accurate use, but there is some literature to back up this time frame. And so what we found was that of the studies that we found, only 9 cook stove, 9 water filter, and 3 pack studies met the inclusion criteria. So very few studies actually met our inclusion criteria. And this was because of limited follow-up, but really because very few studies actually asked participants why they stopped using the intervention, rather than just making measurements of use over time. And of the studies that asked participants why they stopped using the intervention, the most common reason they provided was a lack of maintenance and repair. And we'll go into that in a little more detail. So for those of you who may have to do a scoping review or a systematic review, I know Erica gave a really great presentation a few weeks ago, but this is kind of an example of the search diagram that I created for the water filters. And I use this Prisma for scoping review. It's like an extension. But I think it's kind of wild to see how these numbers change, right? I found 1,020 papers through Web of Science, and then I excluded a whole bunch at the beginning and ultimately only ended up with 9 with my search criteria. And so I have 3 of these for each of the different interventions. All right. So this was the framework that we came up with. On the top are the different use phases. So there's initial acceptance, which includes adoption or uptake studies. Then there's early use, which are habituation studies, and then sustained use, which is something that we are proposing and requires further development and input from the research community. But for initial acceptance, right, this is when the user is making this decision to accept or reject this new intervention into their life. So this is the first step. And then they enter into early use when they start to use the device. And as they use the device, they start learning more about it, and they learn and start to decide whether or not the device actually fits with their lifestyle. And if over time they find that it doesn't really fit with their lifestyle, it might lead to them slowly stopping use of it and then disusing it, and then it goes to abandonment. But for the users that continue using it and they find that it brings benefit to their life, at some point they're going to reach something called a cessation point. And here they have to make a decision to recommit or discontinue use. And if they discontinue, then that leads to abandonment. But if they recommit to this device, they enter into this sustained use kind of cycle. And so we've defined sustained use as a phase of engagement that the user has to successfully overcome after they've successfully overcome a cessation point to continue using this device, right? And then the cessation point, which is here, is a discrete event that requires a user to take action in order to restore functionality or effectiveness of the intervention. So what are these cessation points? And before I get into it too deeply, I wanted to take a step back and just talk about this difference between the two pathways leading to the cessation point and this pathway of disuse, right? Because this pathway of disuse is more of a lack of acceptance of the technology rather than a distinct cessation point. So this lack of acceptance, an example of it could be for point of use water filters, insufficient filtration capacity. So if there's a large family and they've got one water filter, they find that it doesn't provide enough clean water for everyone in the family to use it. So the design of it doesn't fit with the lifestyle of that family. Similarly with cook stoves, I mentioned before, the type of fuel that some cook stoves need. And so if it needs pellets, but you don't have those available, then the user is not going to be able to use it. And there's a design mismatch between what's available to the user and what the cook stove needs. And similarly for PACs or the portable air cleaners, a lot of participants will say that there's issues with drafts and issues with noise. And that has more to do with the fact that it doesn't fit with the lifestyle of that user. And that's different from a distinct cessation point, which from what we've found, were largely tied to hardware issues. So either poor quality, meaning that the participant was using it, or the user was using the cook stove and then the cook stove broke and then they had to go and repair it and then it broke again. Or a lack of or improper maintenance and repair tied to the user's ability to actually do this kind of maintenance and repair. And then they also noted cost and access. So it's like the cost of repair or the cost of replacement parts, and then access to these replacement parts and or services. So maintenance and repair was overwhelmingly identified by users as the main reason for cessation for all three of the health interventions that we looked at. And there was a discussion of, the lack of knowledge of what you had to do in order to maintain or repair the device, or they just felt they didn't have the ability to do this kind of repair or maintenance. And then I mentioned cost in the provisioning of replacement parts and services. So for example, in a study for water filters in Haiti, 9% of participants knew where to find replacement parts. And then in the Cambodian study that I had shown above about with the drop in use of the water filters, only 26% of the participants that were non-users knew where to find these replacement filter parts, despite the fact that the researchers mentioned that distribution centers were located within 20 kilometers of all of the participants. So this means that either the participants didn't know that this distribution center existed, or they felt that it wasn't accessible. Either the cost was too high or the distance was too far. So it was not really accessible for them. And then for these filter studies, the portable air cleaners, the cost and the availability of replacement air filters was identified in all of the studies that we included, highlighting that, there is an issue with the continuing use of these devices. And despite the fact that maintenance and repair was overwhelmingly identified by these users, very few studies actually included any provisions or even discussed maintenance and repair within their design. So why is it that maintenance and repair seems to be kind of neglected? And pulling from science and technology scholars, maintenance and repair allows for a continuation rather than a change. And it's harder to notice this continuation in things versus a stark contrast in change, right? So it's like, I don't know, the satisfaction that you get after, I don't know, or if you are repairing your bike or something, you're not getting a new bike, which kind of maybe is a little more exciting, right? So you're just maintaining it and you don't necessarily see this novelty effect. And so it kind of gets neglected both on the part of the user and perhaps and on the part of the implementer. And some other reasons are that maintenance can be kind of complicated because you don't necessarily know all the time why something needs to be, or why something is not operating as efficiently as it should be. So you have to do some critical thinking and some troubleshooting, and then do some technical work to try and troubleshoot the problem. And then, I had mentioned also the cost of these repair services and the distance that you might have to travel in order to access them. And then it also comes down to the availability of these services or goods. Can you purchase these replacement parts easily? And are they within travel distance? Are they affordable? And so on the part of the implementer, studies have acknowledged it as important, but as mentioned previously, that few of them actually include provisions for maintenance and repair. So some portable air cleaner studies had provided extra filters for participants. A cook stove study talked about how participants wanted training programs so that they knew how to maintain and repair their cook stoves. And then a water filter study discussed access to maintenance and repair technicians. And that was because they had partnered with a nonprofit that had established long ties to the community. And so based on all of the findings that we had in some synthesis, this is kind of what we came up with as drivers for this maintenance and repair or replacement, which falls under the recommitment decision. And so the three main aspects that influence this recommitment, particularly as it is applied to maintenance and repair, are the need for motivation, access, and a prompt. So motivation is the drive to engage in activities to achieve a goal, where access is the use of a provisioning system and the user's ability and accessibility. So the user's ability and the accessibility of provisioning systems. And then this prompt, which is a call to action, because it sometimes can be hard to notice these reductions in efficiency. So the user needs to be cued in order to know, oh, I need to replace the filter, or I need to do X or something to make sure that I can continue using this intervention without it degrading in performance. And so going into it a little bit more detailed, right? Motivation, we said, had inputs of self-efficacy and value. And self-efficacy is a user's self-belief that they can perform the necessary action to achieve an outcome. So do they believe that they can successfully conduct this action that they need to do? And then value is the user's perception of the usefulness and the utility of the intervention. And this can be affected by the risk perception. So if they are highly susceptible to some respiratory disease, respiratory illnesses, they might be more motivated to maintain their portable air cleaner or to use the cook stove. It could also be influenced by emotion, social status, and user experience. So if you see people that are of high social status, you may feel more motivated to also, that are using the intervention, you may also feel more motivated to use the intervention. So for access, we said that the inputs were ability and provisioning systems. And ability is the user's ability to afford and obtain these goods or services. So it's the affordability or the cost of these items, and then the distance and time that they have to travel in order to access them. And so provisioning systems are a little bit vague, but it's complex and interconnected physical and social systems. So it can include markets, manufacturing, government, or community. And so we kind of left this one intentionally general, maybe is a better word, because this one will also depend on what the community wants and what the community needs. So if they have access to the markets, but they don't have the ability to purchase it, then maybe government can come in and provide subsidies. If there's a community that just doesn't have access to these replacement parts, there might need to be some markets that are you might need to put markets in to provide access to these goods and services. Okay. And so for the recommendations, we suggested that intentional multidisciplinary communities of practice were formed. And so this would include users, user advocates, researchers, funders, program officers, manufacturers, and designers. So it's people that like stakeholders that are needed in order to create these interventions or an implementation of these interventions. And so some of the recommendations for them are to make the intervention lifetime explicit in the benefit estimate. So if you are saying that you're going to have some reduction in deaths or diseases over a certain time frame, if that's tied to a cook stove being used over 9 years, you need to make that explicit, because if the cook stove is actually only being used for 2 years, you aren't going to achieve those total benefits, right? The next thing we suggested is to connect the assumed lifetime to known identified cessation points. So you need to find where, and then you need to find where these cessation points are, and then see if you can do things to overcome these cessation points, which is step 3. And then the last recommendation we have is to legitimize studies of recommitment to sustained use. And so there's really not that many studies that look at sustained use. And I think as a community and as this research community, we need to start moving towards that to try and address how we can get people to start using these devices over the long term so that they can realize the full health benefits of using them. And so the main takeaways from this, from the manuscript, is that sustained use has been identified as a challenge in health interventions. But despite this, very few studies measure sustained use, and even fewer identify reasons for cessation. And so we propose a definition of sustained use as a phase of engagement after the user overcomes a cessation point and recommits to this intervention. And then a cessation point, we said, was a discrete event where users must recommit to using this intervention. And we really only identified maintenance and repair as a cessation point. So I think there's a lot more to be done with looking at what other cessation points are there, and how can we encourage users to overcome these cessation points. And then we say, implementation studies should explicitly define sustained use and then identify and overcome cessation points. And then we need to further research on sustained use and how and why people are using things over a long term or over a long period of time. And so some of the next steps, I need to submit the paper. I think I have to cut about 500 words, which is not a lot, but is quite hard to do. And then thinking about how do we test these proposed frameworks, and then how can we leverage some of the data that's being collected in Sapphires for this purpose. And these are my references. So yeah, I'll stop sharing. If anyone has any questions, or I guess I can keep sharing. Yeah.
It looks like Ellison had one earlier on in the chat.
Okay. Oh, yes, I saw. Okay. Yeah, so the theory of planned behavior. So we didn't explicitly discuss the theory of planned behavior, but it was, sorry, let me go back. Here. But the theory of planned behavior is used as, was expanded upon, at least in the technology acceptance model and in the IBM. So we didn't explicitly discuss the two, although I guess maybe we can include a few sentences on that. I think it forms the foundation of a lot of these theories and frameworks.
Yeah, Naomi,
So,
I really like the summary you put together for this slide, and obviously is reflected in the paper. I think I was only asking, or shouldn't say only. I think my main motivation for asking is that despite where the field may have moved in terms of the names for models and how models of change in behavior are framed, many of the engineers that still work in this realm might be more familiar with the theory of planned behavior, because I think it, and I'd love to hear if Christian agrees, but I feel like it sort of rose to the top as the most recognizable theory to point to if people are talking about it. And that isn't to give it legitimacy as like it's more important or it explains things. But I think because of the familiarity, its absence might be noticed. And if you could just anchor like where, was it a precursor? Um, is it really, inadequate? And that's why you're turning to these others. And like I said, I'm sort of pointing at Christian because I'd love to hear if you think that's valid. That's my perspective, and it's not that important.
Yeah, I would
Okay.
agree that it's certainly the first one I knew of, right? That's the term that kind of I was brought up on. I think it's also a term that got massively diluted to mean lots and lots of different
Right.
things potentially.
Mhm.
So I do think it might be worth at least an acknowledgement of the term, and here are then specific ones that have more clear definitions type statement. I'm trying to actually think back. I think some of my textbooks probably used theory of planned behavior as opposed to any of the other ones, but
Okay.
I think adding the idea like Naomi, like you mentioned, adding a sentence or so, it does have major, well, in my view, some pretty big shortcomings, but it is one that's used a lot. I mean, so kind of saying we've moved beyond that, or we did take that into consideration. I appreciate the comment because it is one that we did think about and have it in there because it also did inform a number of other models. So I think adding a sentence or so would be a good way. And so we have to then cut maybe 510 words.
Oh,
Not a problem.
Yeah, no.
No, that's
Word
okay.
cutting is so hard at the end. So I actually, yeah, take what I said with a grain of salt. It was more just like, the absence struck me as something that might have
Yeah.
taken place. So.
No, I think it's a good point, especially the audience that and I think we're headed toward with the paper, and going ahead and acknowledging it avoids someone getting really excited and cranking on us on that when they
Yeah.
missed a couple other things that would have been really useful to tell us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think we have it in there, but only as like, oh, the technology acceptance model is an extension of the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior. So I think it is good to kind of acknowledge it, especially if engineers are more familiar with it, because I think one of the other things with this framework is that, if you have a favorite initial acceptance model, you can put whichever one you want into this. So if originally we had started with like the theory, or no, the technology acceptance model, and then we kind of stepped back from it because after talking to some people, they were like, oh, I hadn't heard of that. So it's like, rather than saying, oh, use this acceptance model or initial acceptance framework, you can put whichever one you want in there.
Yeah.
So I do think that it is that's a good point, especially if engineers are more familiar with the theory of planned behavior. So
and I would
I'll find an
acknowledge, I would
extra 10
say
words.
99% of times I ever had it presented to me in class, it was presented as a concept and then we never actually did anything with it. You
Yeah.
should, think about the people, and then never thought about the people again.
And not only that, think about rational people, which always cracks me up.
Who are those people?
Yeah, actually, I think I've had more times that they said it kind of like tongue in cheek. You want to believe that your users are rational, but designed for the 1% who's going to break your things type.
Yeah, does anyone have any other questions or comments? I am kind of interested in if you saw this kind of framework is this something that you think would be useful to apply to the design or like implementation part of like intervention research?
Yeah, first off, I like the figure. I think it does a great job of kind of hitting the workflow. From your paper standpoint, and like putting on my, hey, my job is to get a technology out into the field, either as like a tech to market or as a research side of things. Balancing these sort of frameworks versus the reality of kind of the real world timelines, I think is where these models have always, I don't want to say fallen flat, but never been really able to be applied, right? The money is gone by the time that that feedback loop occurs. And from a company standpoint, the product has changed so much by the time that an iteration has occurred that's not even quite the same thing anymore. So I love the framework. I'm trying to think of like, as somebody reading a paper like this, how would I implement the pieces? And I don't mean that as like a criticism. I just think I need to kind of like think about that a little bit. Is they always sound like these feedback loops always sound great in practice, and I've never found a way that we were able to actually do it in a real project. Not to say that that means that they've been successful. They probably have failed because we haven't been able to build them in. But there's some major barriers to actually applying them in practice that I've never been able to get over. Again, I know you're 500 words over, but that's like the cynic in me would, I think that'd be the piece I would be wondering about if I was a reader.
Yeah, I think the implementation, like actually using it and applying it, is really challenging, because I think it requires like a shift in the way that all of this research is kind of done to focus more on the long term. And it's just like studies are not really designed to be funded for that long-term perspective. So if the money is not there, it's hard to design something if the money's not there for it.
Yeah. I do think these graphics do a great job of kind of simplifying some of these models into a snapshot view.
Yeah, Tammy really came up with this, and it was mind-blowing when she changed the model that I had originally into this really simplified form, and I was like, this is so elegant in its simplicity. Okay.
Can I follow up and just ask, when we're like in the, like Naomi, if you could go to the, like maybe the last-ish slide where we talk about oh, maybe recommendations. Would it, because partly I think we were kind of saying, hey, this is something we all need to work on. Would it be helpful, I don't know, to maybe give some ideas of how you might at least find out where those cessation points are as you're building your technology or something? Just again, thinking about the comment we might get from some reviewers about, well, this is all great, but it's never going to happen because of X and Y. And so, they're kind of, whereas we're trying to make it be a piece, I think in part, and Naomi, please correct me if I'm wrong here, because I could be really off base. We're trying to bring this forward as something people need to work at, and that we know it won't be easy, and that, we're really going to have to kind of change or push the paradigm, or push the ways of thinking about how you put an intervention out and how you determine, did it work? And I was wondering if there's anything you all are thinking we could add to say, yeah, we realize this is going to be hard, but we can do this, or something like that.
Yeah, I think highlighting where those points are, I think are a good one. I think, taking wearing the egotistical engineer hat piece that I think we hit with a lot of projects. I think there is often a resistance in projects to acknowledge the failures along the way. It's like, try and fix the problem as it's going along, as opposed to letting something run its course long enough to see if it's actually a breaking point. Does that make sense? Like, it's a keep fixing, keep fixing, keep fixing, so you never actually get to a stable enough point that these cessation points occur, right? There is a need to hit a status quo in the project. We see people abandon a technology, and we, at least some of the projects I've been involved in, and we say, well, that isn't a success, so how do we pivot so early on that it's a constantly moving target? And we may not actually learn from those lessons in quite the way that these models are designed to inform us, because we're changing the scenario so frequently. Does that make, like, I'm not sure I'm conveying that very clearly, but
that does make sense. I mean, it's, you design for, the long term, and like as you're going along, you're finding those places where it's messing up, and then like how far out are you pushing it needs to work to X point, and probably that's to the end of the grant period. That initial, grant period or something. But no, that makes sense, that idea of that the failures are important to report or to learn from, and to, think about what the next steps are. And so almost pushing it to where are those cessation points? Because that's one of the things I think, Naomi, you mentioned, we really want to know where those are and what they look like. And there probably is commonality across those cessation points that far out in technologies. And so, valuing that, and that's part of that, I think, number 4, that legitimized studies that are looking at what's the cessation point, where are those, so we know what we can keep pushing the timeline out farther or farther. Yeah. But thanks. That's helpful. This is all helpful. Thank you all.
yeah, I think really conveying the point that sometimes it's better to be or there's value in sometimes being hands off and letting things run a course long enough, even if that means that you're maybe watching a course that is not quite the direction you want
Yeah.
to be. Right? We do that in a clinical trial, we would never intervene midway and change the model, right? But from a technology evaluation study, we do it all of the time.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about, just thinking back to the other projects I've been on with all you all, that, we see it, we fix it, we keep moving forward, and things can sometimes change pretty big along that way versus, a medical study. Or likely what in my field we would do as an intervention, we wouldn't change course typically. We would hope we'd gotten past some early on problems, but we would try to see what happened in that case, of the intervention we were trying compared to no intervention. Yeah. Thanks.
Marilee, I had one other follow-up on your question, since this slide is still up, if we have time. Oh, Kristen, is that okay if we keep going? Or no?
Yeah, I mean, it's 1:51, but we can keep going in a few minutes.
I think papers like this can sometimes feel directed at engineers, especially if they're viewed as early in the pipeline of an intervention's development, like cook stoves being an example. and many others, I think. If it's possible for something like this, e.g. users, user advocates, researchers, funders, program officers, there's a lot of different types of people that could take messages away from this. And I think if you can, without expanding your word count, kind of map groups that could advocate for certain types of work. Like, I think generally, like, if you're gonna get an I don't know how to say this, I'm trying to say it succinctly. If you're an engineer that's going to submit a grant to NSF to focus on an engineering innovation, and then you just try to wedge everything possible into that grant to also address all of these things that are brought up by this framework, I think that's not the right approach. But I love that you brought out this idea of advocating for the value of longer term studies, or even retrospective studies, you could say, like go study failures and look into the past to learn from them in ways that are, that overcome some of the biases of those kinds of studies. So if there's a way to be a little more granular or tailored about who could champion what aspect of a wider suite of studies rather than wedging everything into one study, which I know is not what your paper would say and what your presentation was, but I feel like the distillation, like the hashtag that would go on X, is going to end up making it seem like engineers should do more. They should also do a long-term follow-up study, and maybe they should be involved, but I think it's not the right use of expertise either. There's expertise out there for doing that kind of work, and advocating for its value to maybe be elevated seems potentially more impactful than like trying to fit more into an already packed study.
I think that's a great point, Ellison, because Tammy and Naomi asked me, or I asked them like at one point recently, like, well, what can I do right now? And then they said, think about how we could test this. And so the things I've been thinking about how you could test this, that longer term thing would be more, it's
Mhm.
more on that behavioral science, social science piece of it,
Yeah,
follow-ups, and tell me why you did this and why you did that, and
Yeah.
so on. And it's not the challenges in getting hold of people, doing X and Y with them. But you're right. I think it's that team effort and bringing in some other expertise, and also, thinking about an interdisciplinary team course that could kind of be thinking from that broader sense of
Mhm.
of all those pieces.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for your presentation, Naomi.
Yeah, thank you guys. This was really helpful to get some feedback. I really appreciate that.
You did a great job, Naomi.
Thank you.
Well, that's everything then. Have a good extra long weekend.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.